How can a piece of land smaller than a city park drag two treaty allies and a rising superpower into constant strategic calculation? That question defines Thitu Island, known in the Philippines as Pag-asa. At just 37 hectares, with a short runway and a small civilian community, it should barely register on a map. Instead, it has become one of the most closely watched places in the South China Sea. Chinese Coast Guard ships now routinely press in close, using water cannons, blocking maneuvers, and ramming tactics, incidents that spark protests not only from Manila, but increasingly from Washington. What makes Thitu matter is not its size, but its people. Unlike artificial reefs elsewhere in the Spratlys, Thitu is home to families, teachers, fishermen, children, living under a national flag. That human presence changes everything. Harassing an empty reef is one thing. Doing so within sight of homes and a working airstrip is another. For the U.S.-Philippines alliance, credibility is no longer tested on abstract lines at sea, but in the safety of civilians under Allied administration. In this way, Thitu resembles Japan's remote islands near China, or Taiwan's offshore holdings, small, exposed, and symbolically heavy. These places show how presence, not firepower, anchors deterrence. Thitu fits that pattern, except it sits in a region where gray zone pressure is being normalized as everyday governance. That is why Thitu now weighs so heavily on alliance planning. It forces uncomfortable questions. How much pressure is too much? How to deter without escalation? And how to protect ordinary lives without turning them into military targets. Thitu's lesson is simple and unsettling. Today, strategic consequence is not measured by size, but by who stays. Geography sets the stakes before politics ever enters the room. Thitu Island sits in the heart of the Spratly Islands, roughly 277 kilometers west of Palawan. That distance matters. It places Thitu well inside the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, as defined by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. On paper, the legal geography is straightforward. At sea, however, proximity turns clarity into contestation. Thitu is also one of the very few Spratly features with a permanent civilian population, around 200 to 300 residents, making it not just a military outpost, but a living space. That single fact raises the political temperature of every encounter nearby, because coercion around Thitu is never purely abstract. History explains why the island carries weight far beyond its size. The Philippines has administered Thitu since the 1970s as part of the Calayan Island Group, establishing governance, habitation, and routine resupply long before today's surge in gray zone pressure. Yet Thitu is also claimed by China, Vietnam, and Taiwan, placing it squarely inside one of the most crowded sovereignty disputes on the planet.
The new government here in Manila is grappling with what might be called catastrophic success. What comes next is obviously going to be a delicate balancing act. It is a time for cool heads, and Manila is sensibly, I think, being careful not to flaunt its legal victory.
The legal picture sharpened in 2016, when the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled that China has no lawful basis to claim historic rights within the so-called 9-dash line. The ruling clarified the law. It did not compel compliance. Beijing's rejection of the decision highlights the central tension of the South China Sea. Legal certainty exists, but enforcement power is uneven. Today's reality on Thitu is defined by presence under pressure. The island hosts a small detachment of Philippine Marines, a Philippine Coast Guard element, an airstrip, a pier, basic radar coverage, and limited but growing civilian infrastructure. These are not symbols of militarization. They are instruments of persistence. Yet from 2023 to 2024, that persistence was repeatedly tested. Swarms of 70 to 100 Chinese maritime militia vessels maneuvered near the island.
China's Coast Guard mission number 41559. This is England over 3002.
Water cannon incidents damaged Philippine resupply boats. Close-in maneuvers compressed reaction times and raised collision risks. Each incident stayed below the threshold of open conflict, and that is precisely the point. What followed mattered just as much as what happened at sea. Statements from Washington reaffirmed that attacks on Philippine public vessels would trigger obligations under the Mutual Defense Treaty. For Manila, this validation reinforces deterrence. For Beijing, it clarifies that pressure on Thitu is no longer a purely bilateral issue. And for the region, it confirms that Thitu Island has become a measuring stick, a place where law, geography, civilians, and alliance credibility collide in real time.
Thitu matters because it sits at a quiet crossroads of geography, trade, and power. The waters around the island lie next to sea lanes, carrying roughly $3 to $5 trillion in global trade each year. What's at stake isn't blocking ships, but shaping behavior through presence. A permanently inhabited island like Thitu challenges the idea that the central Spratlys are already settled and uncontested. Geopolitically, Thitu stands out because it is still lived on and administered by the Philippines. While China has fortified several nearby features, Thitu remains a visible reminder that sovereignty is maintained through continuity, regular resupply, civilian life, and daily governance. For the US-Philippines alliance, it has become a credibility marker. If pressure succeeds here, it sends a message far beyond one island. Militarily, Thitu is valuable not for firepower, but for awareness. It functions as a forward lookout, helping monitor movements around nearby Chinese outposts such as Subi, Mischief, and Fiery Cross Reefs. In gray zone competition, seeing early and responding calmly matters more than deploying heavy weapons. Thitu is less a base than a sensor, small, exposed, but hard to replace. The human and economic stakes make this tangible. Surrounding waters support fishing communities and sit near Reed Bank, a key area for future energy security. Disruption here affects livelihoods, food prices, and national resilience. For Manila, protecting access means protecting people. For Washington, it explains why alliance commitments now focus as much on lawful economic activity as on military deterrence. In the end, Thitu's importance is not abstract. It is felt in routines, resupply runs, patrols, families staying put. In the South China Sea, control is rarely decided by battles. It is decided by who can remain, observe, and endure. That is why losing ground at Thitu would not look like defeat, but it would feel like something slowly slipping away. The importance of Thitu becomes clearest when viewed through the architecture of the US-Philippines alliance itself.
Next day in Washington, a first step is taken in the direction demanded by Dewey as the United States and the Philippines sign a mutual defense treaty.
The partnership rests on long-standing foundations. The Mutual Defense Treaty signed in 1951, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement concluded in 2014 and expanded in 2023 to 9 sites, and the steady evolution of large-scale exercises such as Balikatan, now regularly involving Japan and Australia. On paper, these frameworks are broad and region-wide. In practice, they are stress-tested in specific places. Thitu is one of those places. Thitu has effectively become an alliance test case rather than a hypothetical scenario. When U.S. officials state that an armed attack on Philippine public vessels, aircraft, or armed forces anywhere in the South China Sea would trigger MDT obligations, as repeatedly emphasized by Antony Blinken, they are not speaking in the abstract. Incidents around Thitu give that commitment operational meaning. Water cannon attacks, blocking maneuvers, and close-in harassment of Philippine vessels occur in real time, under cameras and civilian visibility. Each event forces alliance planners to ask not if the treaty applies, but how it would be implemented short of war. That is a fundamentally different planning problem than Cold War-era contingencies. For Beijing, Thitu is a pressure point precisely because it sits below the threshold of escalation. Chinese gray zone tactics, maritime militia swarms, Coast Guard intimidation, and calibrated force are designed to probe alliance resolve without providing a clean trigger for military response. The logic is incremental. Normalize pressure, raise costs for the Philippines, and observe whether U.S. backing remains firm. Thitu's civilian population and routine resupply missions make this pressure especially visible, turning every encounter into a live demonstration of alliance credibility. The response has been deterrence through behavior, not slogans. Joint U.S.-Philippines patrols, trilateral activities with Japan, and the growing visibility of allied exercises near contested waters all serve as countersignals. They do not announce red lines. They reinforce patterns. Presence becomes the message. The alliance shows up, operates together, and sustains routine cooperation in contested space. Over time, this behavioral deterrence complicates gray zone strategies by denying easy gains without forcing dramatic escalation. In this sense, Thitu Island has reshaped how the alliance thinks about deterrence itself. It is no longer centered on singular crises or major battles, but on endurance, who can maintain lawful presence, protect civilians, and keep commitments credible day after day. Thitu does not just sit within the U.S.-Philippines alliance framework. It actively shapes how that framework is tested, interpreted, and proven in the South China Sea.
Thitu has forced Manila into a balancing act that is as political as it is operational. On one hand, sovereignty remains a deeply sensitive issue in the Philippines, rooted in history, constitutional limits on foreign forces, and strong nationalist sentiment. On the other hand, the reality of sustained pressure around Thitu Island has made it clear that presence without protection is not a strategy. Philippine security thinking has therefore shifted toward a pragmatic middle ground, asserting national control visibly while quietly tightening alliance coordination. The emphasis is not on inviting permanent foreign bases to Thitu, but on ensuring that Philippine forces operating there are never isolated. Operationally, this pressure has driven a noticeable recalibration. Manila has placed growing emphasis on modernizing the Philippine Coast Guard, recognizing that gray zone challenges are best answered by law enforcement-led responses rather than naval escalation. Resupply operations, once conducted largely by civilian chartered vessels, are now routinely escorted by Coast Guard ships, reducing vulnerability to harassment and signaling state authority without crossing military red lines. Surveillance drones, radar integration, and improved ISR links with the armed forces of the Philippines have further tightened situational awareness around the island. The goal is speed and clarity. See early, respond calmly, document everything. These shifts are not cosmetic. They are adaptations learned in contact. Close encounters with Chinese maritime forces demonstrated that ambiguity invited pressure. By professionalizing escorts and standardizing procedures, the Philippines has narrowed the space for coercion while keeping responses proportional. This approach aligns with Manila's broader doctrine: deterrence through persistence, not provocation. What happens around Thitu does not stay around Thitu. The pressure applied near Thitu Island mirrors the wider logic of US-China strategic competition across the Indo-Pacific. At its core is a clash between two organizing principles: presence versus denial, law versus power. Washington frames its involvement as support for an ally operating lawfully within its maritime entitlements. Beijing, by contrast, consistently portrays US engagement as external interference, arguing that regional disputes should be settled without outside actors.
Thitu exposes the weakness of that argument. The island is not a hypothetical claim. It is administered, inhabited, and resupplied. Its defense therefore becomes less about interference and more about whether power can erase lawful presence through sustained pressure. This dynamic carries direct implications for freedom of navigation and international law. Regular resupply missions, patrols, and diplomatic responses tied to Thitu reinforce the relevance of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in practice, not just principle. Each successful escort and documented incident challenges the creeping normalization of coercion as an accepted tool of maritime governance. The danger is subtle. If water cannons, ramming, and intimidation become routine and unanswered, they quietly rewrite behavior at sea without ever changing the law on paper. Thitu has become one of the places where that normalization is actively contested. Across Southeast Asia, the island is watched more closely than publicly acknowledged. ASEAN states remain cautious, wary of being pulled into great power rivalry, yet deeply attentive to precedents. Thitu is often referenced implicitly rather than by name in discussions around a South China Sea Code of Conduct. It serves as a barometer. If pressure succeeds here without consequence, smaller claimants draw lessons. If lawful presence holds, it strengthens confidence that rules still matter. In that sense, Thitu influences regional stability not through speeches, but through outcomes.
Sa tingin ko po safe sila because no right-thinking nation will attack civilians. Kailangan po natin ng civilian dito because this is for them. This is not just purely for military purposes.
The same factors that make Thitu strategically valuable also make it fragile. Close quarters encounters between Philippine and Chinese vessels compress decision-making time and elevate the risk of miscalculation. A collision, an injury, or a misinterpreted maneuver could rapidly escalate, especially given the shadow of treaty obligations under the Mutual Defense Treaty. The alliance deters aggression, but it also raises the stakes of any serious incident, turning tactical mistakes into strategic crises. Logistics compound these risks. Thitu's remoteness makes resupply inherently vulnerable to weather disruptions and harassment. Limited infrastructure constrains surge capacity during crises, while harsh maritime conditions test both equipment and personnel. Every delay matters. Every damaged vessel becomes a strategic signal. These realities explain why Manila has focused so heavily on escort protocols and redundancy rather than dramatic force deployments. Political constraints further narrow the margin for error. The Philippines must manage a complex diplomatic balance, sustaining alliance credibility with the United States while avoiding a complete rupture with China, asserting rights without fracturing ASEAN unity. Overreaction risks escalation and regional division. Underreaction risks normalization of pressure. Thitu sits precisely in that narrow corridor where restraint and resolve must coexist.
For the Philippines, resilience should remain the guiding principle. Continued investment in dual-use infrastructure, airstrips, piers, communications, strengthens sustainability without overt militarization. Regularized Coast Guard-led resupply escorts should be institutionalized as standard operating procedure, not ad hoc responses. At the diplomatic level, consistent legal messaging anchored in UNCLOS keeps incidents framed as violations of law, not clashes of power. For the United States, support should stay visible but measured. Deepening ISR cooperation, intelligence sharing, and non-lethal assistance directly enhances Philippine capacity while preserving Manila's lead role. Rotational presence, rather than permanent basing, aligns deterrence with regional sensitivities. Just as important, deterrence must be paired with crisis management mechanisms, clear channels, de-escalation protocols, and disciplined signaling to prevent accidents from spiraling. Jointly, the alliance can widen the aperture, expanding maritime domain awareness networks, establishing shared incident response playbooks,
and integrating humanitarian and environmental cooperation reduce escalation risks while broadening legitimacy. These steps reinforce the idea that stability, not dominance, is the objective, and that lawful presence benefits the region as a whole. Thitu Island's strategic relevance far exceeds its physical size. It has become central to alliance credibility, deterrence dynamics, and the lived contest between rules and pressure in the South China Sea. At Pag-asa, geography, law, alliance politics, and gray zone competition converge in real time. The island shows how modern conflict is shaped long before shots are fired, through presence, persistence, and perception. Looking ahead, Thitu will remain a litmus test, not just for U.S.-Philippines resolve, but for crisis management, regional stability, and the future of the rules-based maritime order itself. As Indo-Pacific competition intensifies, the question Thitu poses will only grow sharper. When law and pressure collide, which one holds?
If you liked the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for deep analysis of contemporary issues.